Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive in.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Manufacturing Talks. I'm Jim Vinosky, your host, and I'm really glad to be joined today by Ed Marsh. He is the founder and principal at Ed Marsh Consulting, a manufacturing consultancy, and host at Industrial Growth Institute podcast. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim.
Oh, glad to have you. Yeah, you and I have had some back and forth, both on video and via messages online, and it's just amazing how much we've got in common. So really looking forward to hearing your perspectives on some of the hot button issues of the industrial world.
Yeah, and I've got my own perspective on it. Others may not agree that they're hot buttons, but I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention the guys at Variable for connecting us originally as well. I'm grateful for that connection.
Yes, Matt Horine connected us up thinking we had those alignments, and sure enough, he was right about that. So thank you, Matt. So before we get going, Ed, why don't you just give us your background, how you got into doing what you're doing today?
So I think, like many people, it was kind of an accidental journey that brought me to where I am. I went to Johns Hopkins to be an engineer. Then I went into the Army running raids and ambushes. And then I realized that I wanted to, I was married and wanted to stay married and wasn't sure I could do that in the Army. And so I wanted to learn business. And the first step was to learn sales. And so I started learning industrial sales as a rep, as a sales manager. I was fortunate. I had great training early in my career, kind of set the stage for understanding industrial sales at a high level. Then I became partners with a German company running the U.S. operation. And then the euro started to turn against us. And so I went to India and set up a company in India, taking used machines from the U.S. to India. 2008, 2009 was a hard time for both those businesses, and worked on a couple of other things for a couple of years, and then set up my consulting business, originally helping companies, American manufacturers, export. And then as we went from exporting, I'd say, okay, well, let's internationalize your marketing, but the marketing was poor. So then we'd work on digital marketing. And then I'd help companies create a bunch of leads, and they wouldn't sell any of them. So I said, okay, well, we need to work on your sales. And then it kind of led to this integrated methodology that I have that I actually believe is very much akin to the way industrial companies manufacture things. A systems overview with process engineering and continuous improvement. Recognize you've got a lot of integrated steps. You can find priorities of where you can get the biggest bang for improvement, but you can't just treat things as silos. They all have to fit together in a system. And so that's kind of how I ended up where I am now, working a lot with lower and middle market industrial manufacturers, a lot of them capital equipment companies, some U.S. subsidiaries of German companies, some family owned, many sponsor owned by private equity firms that kind of have a very clear 7-year runway to get through it. So that's the short version of a long, complicated background.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating one. The sales part is one that you don't see that often. So I found that really intriguing. And that kind of goes directly into one of your main focus areas is revenue growth. So talk a little bit about that at the 10,000 foot level.
Yeah. So, I mean, you talk to these companies that have spent 20 or 30 years improving their manufacturing, and they've brought incredible rigor and intellectual resource and outside consultants and everything, black belts and Six Sigma, and they run Kaizen sessions and they do all this. And of course they can always get better, but they're really good. And if you contrast that to the way they do their marketing and sales, there's a very sharp contrast. There's often very little analogous rigor in marketing and sales. And we can even go up to the board level. We can talk about the board directors, and often there's strong engineering and strong finance background on the board, family members in many cases, but you don't find marketing and sales. You don't find that revenue growth function represented on the board. If you do, it's somebody did it early in their career 40 years ago when buyers were completely different. There was no internet. There was only the Green Thomas register, and it's a different world now. Right. And so I think that we can recognize that what we take for granted today, that companies run their manufacturing a certain way, wasn't taken for granted 30 years ago. And many companies went through a fairly traumatic and wrenching change to get there. And it doesn't mean that the revenue growth change has to be as wrenching and traumatic, but it does mean that we have to be willing to go through some change and understand that buyers are changing. The use of the internet is changing. AI is impacting the way people research. Many customers would prefer a rep-free experience. 75%, I think, say they want a rep-free experience. I think McKinsey, if I remember correctly, had research that something like 50 or 60% of buyers were willing to do six-figure transactions using e-commerce now. HubSpot, that kind of defined the inbound digital content marketing sort of world, has seen keyword rankings and traffic on their blog plummet by about 80% over the last 18 months. So each of these are kind of independent data points, but you weave them together in a picture and you realize what got a typical lower middle market industrial manufacturing firm to where they are probably won't get them to where they need to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because I see it so often where manufacturers are hyper busy. And so that there's that tendency just to gravitate toward what worked in the past and what they're comfortable with. And that what you're saying is it's going to get them into trouble.
Yeah, and the other aspect of it is many, particularly family-owned firms, but many industrial manufacturing firms don't want to grow at 20% a year because that introduces a whole nother set of problems. You got to blow the walls out of the building, and you got zoning problems, and you got storage trailers you got to rent, and a truck to drive to the warehouse across town, and personnel. You can't hire enough people. So there's a lot of compelling reasons why you might not want to grow at a very rapid clip. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that you can't get new logos, so you reduce the concentration risk. It doesn't mean that you can't increase margins. So there's ways that you can increase EBITDA and improve the stability of the business without 20% per year growth.
Yeah, and that's fascinating because it gets to that corporate strategy that is also something that manufacturers have historically struggled with, is having that longer term vision. And in fact, today I've argued that a lot of our financial measures and the kind of focus areas like you talked about around continuous improvement make it difficult to have that lens.
I think that's a fair argument. I'd be interested in reading some of your thoughts on that. It sounds thought-provoking. I would argue also that the obsessive focus on the products that we make or the services we deliver also makes the strategy very myopic, because if the way we define the world is through our product roadmap with, some sequence of new features that we're going to add to this product that the brilliant inventor and founder of the company came up with 70 years ago, that still is the core essence of our being. That's not a strategy. That's just kind of habit.
Yep. Interesting. Now, one thing you had mentioned kind of in our prep for this is that manufacturers should bring that continuous improvement mindset that they had focused on manufacturing into those other areas. So talk a little bit more about that.
So if we think about OEE from a manufacturing perspective, I think everyone's familiar with that. A 10-step process. Our net quality output is the product of the efficiency of each of those steps. So if we've got 10 steps, 97% efficient, we only have an 83% efficient process. Doesn't sound nearly as good as a 97% efficient step. But across a manufacturing operation, there's many, many, many steps. And we've got the same across strategy and all the functions of marketing and all the functions of sales and all the functions of customer success, where we want to land and expand and upsell and cross-sell and sell other products and sell repeat orders and all that kind of stuff. So across that large number of steps in that process, if we take an integrated view of the system, we can identify the major conversion points or the inflection points or the areas where we're particularly inefficient, or where improving efficiency, even a small amount, would dramatically improve the net impact at the end, whether it's EBITDA or revenue or number of new accounts or whatever the case may be. So I think that we can really co-opt that concept that's helped us improve manufacturing and apply it to the revenue growth by identifying those key levers where we can focus. As soon as we fix that, then of course there's always the next highest priority to work on. And so we can continue to work down through the system. And do we only want to do one thing at a time? Probably not. I think everyone needs to be doing video right now. Whether your biggest problem is you don't know how to hire salespeople or not, you need to be doing video. So you can't just do one at a time, but certainly you're not going to boil the ocean, as the saying goes, and do all of them. And that continuous improvement mindset gives us a good handrail for figuring out how we prioritize what we're working on.
Yeah, you raise a superb point around we've got these tools out there and we've had them focused on the same thing for literally decades in most cases now. Um, you probably don't have the highest opportunity in those areas you've been focused on for 10 or 20 years.
Right.
One thing I've hit on quite a bit since I started this show is even people new to the continuous improvement mindset, your biggest bang for the buck may not be on the manufacturing floor. It could be in business processes, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And speaking of process, in almost every case, a great manufacturing firm is going to have very clearly identified process for making things. They'll have
Right.
jigs, they'll have fixtures, they'll have, the BOM. All of this stuff is really well documented and codified and understood and tweaked and experimented. In contrast, and it will all be managed by an ERP. In contrast,
Right.
you can go into many manufacturers that don't have a CRM, the analog to the ERP, if you will, and they don't have a formally documented sales process. And those are just great examples of this contrast that often exists between the two sides of the business.
Absolutely. And to your point, modern technology is bringing us tools to make that a whole heck of a lot easier nowadays too, right?
That's absolutely true. Of course, in the case of CRM, the question is that because it's Big Brother and the company wants to make sure the reps are working? I would argue that it's not to make sure they're working. If that's your question, you've hired the wrong people. There's that information is a business asset. And if in the unfortunate circumstance, somebody's killed in a car accident, a sales rep on the road or whatever the case may be, that has to be documented. But I don't think you can also properly forecast and manage salespeople if that stuff isn't documented, because you end up wasting their time asking them to brief you on things that as a sales manager, you ought to have clear insight into so that you can listen to a recording, look at the information they've entered into the CRM, identify a dissonance between what you expect for a qualified opportunity versus what they've done, and use that as a foundation for a quick and effective coaching session. So, I mean, I think the great salespeople, in my experience, value CRM. Now, they don't like stupid fields. They don't like a cumbersome system. It takes a ton of time to do stuff. They don't like something that doesn't have a good mobile app. But great salespeople cherish tools that will make them more efficient and more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. To your point about that documented methodology for sales, then are there tools that are new, AI-based things that enable that process?
So, I mean, everyone's talking about AI.
Of course. Yep.
So there's certainly plenty of tools. I'm not sure how good they all are. And I would back up and I would differentiate between sales methodology, which is and sales process is the series of steps you have to go through from a new prospect to a closed won order, or maybe even to a reorder. Sales methodology describes the way you follow that process, the kinds of questions you ask, the language that you use, all those sorts of things. But then there's others. There's a sales playbook that you ought to be able to hand a new rep that describes from their first step through closing a deal what they do, how the process works, what you expect for deal qualification, what sales enablement content the marketing team has created, what great content marketing like you work with companies on is available that's appropriate for them to share with the right member of the buying team at the right stage in the buying journey. That's a playbook with all of that. Then a deal qualification scorecard. Critical, because as we talk about more complex deals with larger buying teams and long sell cycles and risk aversion and all those kinds of things, being very thoughtful in our deal qualification, or even adopting a philosophy of disqualification as opposed to trying to qualify them in. Let's routinely try to qualify them out and have a very well documented framework by which those decisions are made. So again, sales managers can coach to it. Great reps know what's involved. Senior management, when they get the forecast, they know if we're told this deal's qualified, we know that it checks these boxes, has answered these questions. And will we win everyone? No, of course not. But it's much more than just somebody vomiting crap into the pipeline because somebody said, "Hey, you got to drive your pipeline dollars up."
Yeah. I like that terminology. Let's get back up to the kind of 10,000 foot level again. One point I know that you're kind of hammering on as well is the role of executives and board members. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, as I touched on earlier, I believe that if the board's role is to hire and fire the CEO and to ask the questions, to approve the strategy, to make sure that the CEO and through the CEO, his or her executive team is moving the company in the direction, managing risk, and working toward achieving the strategy that everyone's agreed to. Fundamentally, there's some element of revenue. Now, even if the company doesn't want to grow, they have to be improving profitability, and they can't just stand still. So that means somebody has to be asking questions about revenue growth. And if nobody on the board has any contemporary marketing or sales or revenue growth experience, then I don't believe that the board can ask the appropriate questions, provide the proper oversight, and evaluate the answers they get back. It's not the board's job to execute, to run the business. It's nose in, fingers out, as the saying goes. But if you don't have that fundamental understanding, I don't know how you even know what kinds of questions to ask and how to evaluate the answers when you get them back.
Mm-hmm. Is there a tendency among manufacturers to have a difficulty in that separation? I know, it's kind of stereotypical for those of us who come off the plant floor to want to have our fingers in everything, right?
So I would say
Yet
the
you're
tendency,
saying that can't be the case with the board members.
yeah, for sure. I mean, it's the CEO's job to run the executive team to manage the business. It's not the board's job to manage the business. Now, board members can be available as mentors or as advisors, and it helps to build relationships with members of the executive team, but it's not the board's job to run the business. It's the board's job to decide we need to replace the CEO if the CEO isn't getting the job done.
Yep.
All that being said, there has to be enough familiarity with the various business functions in order to provide proper governance. To your question about manufacturers, what I see is that often manufacturing boards are probably too disinvolved, that they kind of get together for a golf meeting or a cocktail once a quarter maybe, or a Zoom meeting or something like that. It's a fairly pro forma meeting. They look at some financials. Often there isn't a lot of prep ahead of time, so they waste time together as a group talking about things that people should have looked at. And so then the time for questions where we're really testing and evaluating, and what are we doing about tariff risk? What are we doing about cyber risk? What are we doing about the competitor that likely is building some sort of an AI-enabled model that we haven't even begun to think about? I mean, those are the kinds of conversations that would be, in many cases, fruitful to have in a board meeting, but they don't get to those because it's often family, it's people that are very strongly steeped in the tradition, and all important representatives for sure. But if the board's goal is kind of higher level governance, making sure that the CEO is developing and following a strategy and executing on all these different areas, I think it's helpful to have independent directors that have some of that outside experience.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. It sounds too like the chairman also has a big role in setting those expectations, preparation, execution of the board functions.
For sure. And in many middle market privately held companies, the CEO and the chair are the same person.
Right.
So in some cases, having a lead independent director can be really good. And particularly if there's a lot of family, there have to be, there's some experts. I interviewed a guy, Josh Gentile, on my podcast, who does a lot of work with family businesses. And folks like him are particularly adept at helping families understand the difficult decisions they've got to make and build good structures to maintain strong family and differentiate that from strong business. And there's a lot of art and science around how to do all that kind of thing. But, it's definitely an area where I think a lot of companies have an opportunity to improve their game.
It's fascinating to hear that. And I wish I'd heard this a few years ago. I'm in the process of finishing up the writing of a book that's singing the praises of the unsung heroes of American manufacturing. And I've got, 20 companies, most of which are family run,
right?
That also most of which have stood the test of time, at least up till now.
Right.
Multi-generation firms, you'd think they have to be getting some of that right, but sounds like that may not necessarily always be the case, even if they're on paper successful.
Well, by definition, I mean, I guess if they're successful, things are okay. Now, can they improve for the future? If we take this continuous improvement mindset, is that the next place they might want to look? I think that's certainly an important question to ask. For anyone listening who's interested, there's an event held every May in Washington, D.C., put on by MLR Media, and I think it's by Private Director Magazine. It's called the Private Company Governance Summit, which has a lot of really inspiring representatives, in many cases family, in some cases PE sponsor-owned companies, and talks about all of these issues of governance and strategy and the role of the board and how the board interacts with the executive team and all those kinds of things. It's, I think, a great event. I strongly recommend it.
All right. Is there a link to that I can include in the show notes?
I will shoot you one afterwards. Yes.
Wonderful. I'll put that in there. Yeah, I think that would be right along the lines of what some of these folks who might be interested in pursuing your path can dig into. Now, you've talked a couple times about private equity, and I've had some revelations as I've studied these companies around some of the potential downsides of having private equity involved in your business. And one of those is, you mentioned the 7-year glide path, is how do you kind of serve both masters? You've got the private equity that wants the exit in a few years, but you've got a company that you want to last for generations, and you have to have that long-term view and strategy. How do you square that circle?
So I think there's been a lot of ink spilled recently about private equity, and it's not been entirely positive. And certainly there is a playbook that's existed for years where private equity buys companies, they eviscerate them, they ship everything overseas. It's all some sort of a balance sheet transformation, and there's no real value creation. That's not the experience that I have. In the lower and middle market industrial manufacturing space, I see owners that express those emotions that you talked about. They don't want to sell. I mean, private equity plays an important role helping an owner who's developed a business that's faced with, ownership and leadership transition questions and estate tax implications and everything else. It's a way to take some or all the chips off the table. Mm-hmm. But many owners also want to ensure the durability and the viability of their business and preserve that legacy. And there are private equity operators that there are many who say it, and there's some who actually embrace it and who do it. In some cases, it requires fairly substantial transformation within a company. If a company is really stuck in a business model 20 years ago, and they're not getting new logos and they can't increase prices, that's probably not going to be compatible from an organic growth perspective with the private equity firm's expectations. On the other hand, if they're open to experimenting and improving and they really, embrace the legacy and want to remain part of it, then I've seen that work very well as well. The difference from my perspective, where I want to see companies thrive and succeed, and I'm biased and I'm skewed, but I believe that means they have to change the way they're going to market. They have to change their revenue growth. The advantage from my perspective of working with private equity is they've got a clear timeline and they've got a clear set of KPIs, and often in a family business, they're okay. If we lose a little money, that's okay. If we make a little money, that's okay. We're paying the country club membership. We're employing the kids. Everyone's college tuition is getting paid. We're an anchor employer in the small town where we exist. We don't want to disrupt that. So there's a set of expectations often embedded in a family-owned business that means that they're less open to talking about the kind of change that I believe is important.
It's interesting to hear you say that there are a lot of those good examples out there. And yet I've tried to connect with people and get them to talk, because I don't want to tear down private equity like others have. I do think there's a strong role to be played there. And yet people don't want to talk about what makes for good private equity involvement. Why that and omerta among that group? I
can't answer. And maybe it's because their exposure to it is through the stories that they read about some of those unsavory early sorts of business practices. Yep. Maybe it's because they personally were in a company where the owner perhaps didn't have a good investment banker and didn't vet the financial buyers as carefully as they could have. It's interesting for me when I see a family business that is simultaneously looking at strategic acquirers and financial acquirers, because I think that gives them a very different sort of an understanding of what the path forward is going to look like. And I think it helps them make informed decisions. And in some cases, some of these companies pursue an ESOP as a way to help the owner take some chips off the table, but very tightly control the ownership of it with the group that has a very strong vested interest in it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And I've read some of the positives around the ESOP direction, and saw one in real life just last week. So that's a whole other subject. And really both of those are going to be increasing in frequency and application, because the fact is we've got a bunch of baby boomers who want to exit their companies and not enough people to take over, whether it's their children or other buyers.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that 10 years ago, you heard a lot of people who said, I'm going to die at my desk. I love what I'm doing. I'm going to work this way. And now suddenly they're deciding, well, maybe I'd like to spend 10 years in Florida or whatever the case may be. So I think you're right. I think there are going to be more transactions.
Yeah. So I love the idea of touting the good ones so that there's some written record of what makes for a good one.
Yeah. And I would say that an interesting trend that I've seen is that increasingly the thoughtful private equity people are saying, we understand. And in fact, there's a lot of data and research from Bain and McKinsey and groups like that. I mean, sophisticated thinkers about these things, who are saying that this model of simply reengineering the balance sheet or trying to cut costs, it's not creating the value that we need for exits anymore. And so and even inorganic growth can be, acquisitions and bolt-ons can be an important step, but companies have to be able to execute organic sales growth. And that means new logos and it means price increases. And so many sales teams talk a good game, but when it comes down to it, the chitter chatter is empty because the pitter patter doesn't follow. They can't actually land those new logos. And that's a critical piece to make the whole formula work.
Yep, for sure. So then, let's follow that line and dive deep again, because one thing you queued up with me was the changing of mindset from internal focus to focusing on the customer, the consumer. So talk a little bit about what needs to be happening there.
All right. Well, I hope your stats for viewership don't crater at this point, because what I'm going to say is going to make some people unhappy, but nobody cares about what you make. Nobody cares about what you make or the service you provide. They care about the outcome on their business. And if we persist, and I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir, because obviously your content creation is built around this idea of talking about things besides the product. But if we just persist in talking about what we do and who we are, and about us slide decks and culture videos, and we're 70 years old, we got a 120,000 square foot facility, we have these machines, we have this many employees, here's a picture of our company picnic last year. Nobody cares. What they care about is how what you do impacts their business, the outcome that you will help them achieve in their business. That means then that all of our marketing and all of our sales needs to focus on helping our prospects and large buying teams, across the company, often 10 people for complex, big ticket B2B buying decisions these days. We need to help them understand why this is important for them personally and professionally, why it's important for the business. We need to help them quantify their problem, view their situation in a way that they haven't before. And so by doing that, not only do we increase the likelihood that we'll get a sale, and we have to be very diligent that we're only going to sell to places where it actually will benefit them. We're not going to take opportunistic sales where it's only to our benefit. But further, by doing that, we substantially differentiate ourselves from our competition, not because we've got another feature in our product, but because we have marketed and sold in a way that has helped the prospect better than any of our competitors by virtue of the questions we ask and the information that we share.
Yep. Now, one thing that I think people should realize is there is power in their past story to the extent that it ties to what you're saying, right? I mean, if a company, I'll give you an example. I learned about Regalware over in Wisconsin, makers of pots and pans and small kitchen appliances. They've been around as Regalware since 1946, I think it was. And then they also merged with Westvend Appliances, which dates back to the early 1900s. So a lot of the kind of thing you can lament is, dwelling on that history doesn't sell product, but to the extent that they re-engineered their processes and their approach, even, for example, hiving off their manufacturing arm so that it also became a contract manufacturer.
Mm-hmm.
There, to me, that's the kind of story you tell to tie in with, here's what we can do for you today.
Yeah, I think Marcus Sheridan talks about a known and trusted brand. And certainly those kinds of stories, particularly I would argue in the B2C world, will help create a known and trusted brand.
Yep.
And there's value in that. What I see is a lot of B2B salespeople that work hard to get a discovery meeting and go into the discovery meeting and pull out their laptop and start going through an About Us deck. And you lose somebody at that point.
Oh, yeah, for sure. To your point, the customer's thinking about himself, right? Or herself.
Thinking about, keep hearing the email chime ringing, their phone's vibrating in their pocket, and this meathead wants to sit here and make me listen to this stuff that means nothing to me.
Well put. Let's talk about your business a little bit. So clearly what you've been talking about are the kinds of things you're focused on, but what are you looking at, like opportunities today, challenges today, and then looking to the future for your own firm?
So I think the big challenge today is that the internet changed things. It went from the Green Thomas Register books to essentially an online analog, and it reduced the importance of salespeople, and many salespeople became commoditized. But the buying process stayed relatively similar, and that's changing now. And some of it's because of AI. Some of it's because the volume of content is so overwhelming that people won't pay attention to it. Some of it's because, as the Jolt effect talks about, there's a substantial increase in risk aversion and how people make decisions. Some of it's because of larger buying teams. There's all these factors at play, but what we know is that statistics vary, but 50 to 70% of sales reps are chronically missing quota. That 70% of the time, companies, vendors on a short list were known to a buyer before they even had a project. And only 16% of the time, after they've reached out to vendors, do they ever change the spec. So this idea that we can prospect for open projects and we can somehow talk them into the fact that our technology is better and we can win the order, it's a fallacy, unless you want to bank on 16% odds. The research from SparkToro shows that I think it's only 29% of all Google searches result in an organic link click anymore. So fundamentally, the way people are researching projects, thinking about their business, consuming information, engaging with salespeople have all changed. And if we try to do trade shows and some prospecting the way we've done in the past and just do it faster or harder or whatever the case may be, we're going to see increasingly, I think, problematic results. So we have to step back and really think about the way we approach it differently in terms of a lot more video, in terms of pre-awareness content, in terms of content that will help people understand their business well outside of what we do, but in adjacent areas so we can become a resource, content that can be passively consumed when they're giving the dog a bath or carrying the trash out or driving to work or whatever the case may be. Yep. Superb salespeople. I think that our goal needs to be, there's a lot of talk about AI sales agents. I believe that human salespeople in complex sales will be very effective, but we have to hire second standard deviation talent. We can't take an average salesperson and somehow make them effective. We have to find superstars. We have to do that consistently and effectively. So there's a lot of these changes happening in the background that I believe it's really important for leadership and boards and owners to understand. And some of it's unpleasant, some is uncomfortable, some they might not want to act on, but I believe very strongly, at least know what's happening, know what you would have to do to get ahead of it. understand the areas that you could prioritize to make progress on, and then you can make informed business decisions as opposed to just hoping that we get more leads at the show next year. So that's the essence of what I'm doing in my business these days.
Very cool. And it sounds like it's a big kind of combo of having people who understand how technology in the modern world is changing the business environment and then can make use of those same tools to get you ahead.
Or at least be willing to understand it. I mean, there's a guy named Rick Krantz that with Kelly, his daughter, started the AI Marketing Automation Lab, which I would argue is improperly named because it's gone well beyond marketing at this point. But it's a beautiful opportunity for not only for individual contributors or for director or manager level people to go and build AI tools that they can use. I mean, for instance, if I'm a sales manager and half my sales reps don't even look at the prospect's LinkedIn before they have a discovery meeting, that gives me angina. On the other hand, if I can create a tool that will let them in 5 minutes do a really sophisticated deep dive enabled by AI into their buyer, the entire buying team, the company strategy, all that kind of stuff, and have that in a digest and coach them on how to use that to inform their discovery call questions, that's powerful to me. But I don't want to pay a developer to do that. And if I want to change it on Thursday, the way I built it on Tuesday, I want to be able to do that. So this marketing lab or this AI lab helps people do that. But I would take it a step further. And I would argue that if I'm the president of a $200 million company, I don't want to be a programmer. I don't want to be a developer. I don't want to be creating AI tools, but I want to understand AI well enough so that I've got a good sense of whether we're using it appropriately and broadly enough in the company. And so I might go in there with my own idea and build one just to see what's involved and see how long it takes and see how easy it is and get a sense for what's involved just so that I can make better leadership and management decisions. So I think that's a great resource.
Yeah. There's another guy who, if you don't know already, you should know, is Mush Khan, another industry consultant. He's more on the mobility and electrification end, but definitely connect with him on LinkedIn. And he made the point when we talked probably a year ago that really up and down through an organization, if everyone isn't at least playing around a little with AI, you're falling behind.
And that means more than just using Clippy to help read your email. I mean, really doing something.
Yep, exactly. Well put. Well, we're about out of time, but all important question: what haven't I asked that folks all out there ought to know?
Well, fortunately, you didn't ask anything that embarrassed me to be following Mike Rowe, because I mean that's I'm in an unenviable spot in your lineup of shows. I think maybe the question would be, this is so overwhelming. There's so much.
Yeah.
How do we start? And I would say the way to start is probably, I mean, I could give people a reading list where they can begin to think about sales differently. They can read gap selling. They can read baseline selling. They can read the challenger sale. They can read the jolt effect. They can read Marcus Sheridan's new book, Endless Customers. They can read story branding. If they make it through those, that will give them a good background, a lens, if you will, through which they can begin to think about what they're doing and how their customers are changing. And then if they reach that point where they say, you know what, we've done really well for a number of years, but we probably do need to begin to change, then at that point, I'd love to have a conversation with them.
Well said. Well, great, Ed. This was a absolutely phenomenal conversation. So I appreciate you being on with us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it and have great respect for the way that you've created content and established your footprint and your articles on Forbes and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm flattered to be here with you today.
Well, thank you very much. The feeling's mutual. And in fact, I'm going to be also on Ed's podcast. So we're trading off here, which was another great idea that Matt brought us. Thanks again to Matt. And of course, Absolutely. As always, thanks to those of you in the audience. You are why we're here. I can't promise every show is going to be as educational as what Ed brought us today, but we try to make them all at least a little educational. And we're here every Tuesday. And plus now we're doing short clips of every show that air all week long. So take a look at the short ones. And then if it's interesting, like what Ed brought, tune into the longer one and watch the whole thing. So until next time, I'm Jim Vinosky signing off from Manufacturing Talks. So long.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vanoski. Watch for new episodes dropping every Tuesday. And don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.